everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which time zone you're joining us from. And welcome to this Godan Data Ethics webinar. This is an extension of Godan's wider work on data ethics, and we'll be bringing to you expert opinions and research on diverse aspects of data rights and ethics. We're absolutely delighted to have here with us today Professor Sabina Leonelli and Dr. Hugh Williamson from the Exeter University Centre for the Study of Life Sciences. And they'll be talking to us about their work on data ethics and sustainable agricultural practices in precision farming. Just for those of you that are not very familiar with Godan and what we do, then I'll just talk you through very, very briefly before handing over to Sabina and Hugh. So Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition supports the proactive sharing of open data to deal with the urgent challenges of ensuring world food security and zero hunger. At the heart of Godan, there is a network of over 1,200 partners from governments, private sector and public sector organisations. And we focus on building high-level support among government ministers, policymakers, international organisations and the public sector. We look at promoting collaboration to harness the growing volumes of open data generated by new technologies in order to solve nutrition and food security challenges. If you'd like to find out a little bit more about Godan and what we do, then you can have a look at www.godan.info/about Godan and find out more about what we do and how you can get involved. So I would like to, without very much ado, introduce you to Professor Leonelli and Dr. Williamson. Professor Leonelli is Professor in Philosophy and History of Science at the University of Exeter, where she co-directs the Centre for the Study of Life Sciences and leads the governance strand of the Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. And Dr. Williamson is a Research Fellow at the Centre for the Study of Life Sciences at the University of Exeter. And they're both working on the Alan Turing Institute project From Field Data to Global Indicators, which they'll be sharing with us today. So I believe, Sabina, you were going to talk to us first.
Thank you very much. Yes, Kate. And if you want to stop sharing your screen, exactly, then I can share mine and start the presentation. Thank you. Okay, perfect. I believe you should be able to see my screen now. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this webinar. It is a great privilege to talk to all of you, particularly because I've been admiring the work that Godan has done in this area for many years, and it is really a pleasure to be able to collaborate and exchange insights about these very important issues. So what I want to talk about today is what does it mean to make crop data sharing both responsible and reliable. Very often in this space, one talks about the fact that agricultural and plant data can fuel precision agriculture, can fuel the implementation of artificial intelligence tools in this area. And what we're trying to point to is the types of social intelligence that need to complement this way of thinking about artificial intelligence and environmental intelligence, if you want. So what we'll be doing today is thinking about what does it mean to look for the right data for artificial intelligence in precision agriculture. Clearly, what we need here, and Godan has a lot of work in this area, is to have reliable data and metadata that are machine learnable and can act as a high quality reference point for instance, the building of machine learning tools. And these data need to concern lots of different kinds of phenomena and parts of the world, crops, but also relevant climates, soil conditions, and the socioeconomic milieu in which crops are cultivated. They also need to be relating to the materials on which data are collected, particularly when it comes to germplasm specimens and samples of the soil, for instance. And they need to be integrated with domain-specific knowledge. And given the types of domains and the variety of domains involved in this area, this becomes quite an important challenge. So the conditions for thinking about what constitutes trustworthy data sharing and integration, what kind of data resources can we trust and why, these conditions are determined by clearly technologies that we are using, and a lot of work internationally by researchers is focusing on this. What kind of software and hardware to rely upon, what kind of data infrastructure should be set up, and how should these infrastructures be set up, and most importantly, what kind of standards to adopt within these infrastructures. For instance, from crop descriptors and how we describe the trait of plants that we're interested in, to ontologies that we are using to capture the classification of the data, to the ways in which we describe and require metadata when we share data. But technology is only part of the conditions for trustworthy data sharing. Skills play a very important part here. And this is particularly important because we are looking at an ever-expanding collection of skills that are relevant in this area that range from the ability to interact with the software and the digital technologies available here, to understanding of the specific crops and the conditions under which they grow and develop, to an understanding of the socioeconomic environment in which the crops are relating, and the standards that are used to capture this information. And this means that the role of data scientists and the interaction between data scientists and domain experts in all of these different facets of agricultural development and precision agriculture is really important. And there's still a lot of work to be done to think about how these different skills can be put together and can be put to good use and in dialogue with each other. And this, of course, brings me to the question around which policies, which kind of legal agreement, which kind of governance needs to define and monitor what constitutes lawful data access and data use in this area. How can we use regulation to make sure that the right kind of skills are put in dialogue with each other, that technologies are used which are actually advantageous to all the stakeholders involved? And ultimately, how do we guarantee the ethics and the accountability of these processes of data sharing and making data available? So questions like, how does one acknowledge, and most importantly, how does one reward the provenance of the data, the people that actually are generating the data in the first place, are really, really important, particularly in a situation where data are shared around the world and in a world which has very unequal relations when it comes to who provides the data, who is working as a breeder or as a farmer in this area. Questions around, how does one allocate responsibility for how data are linked and put together, how data are processed and are reused, and what kind of mistakes may be made in these kinds of systems, what kind of concerns may arise. It's very difficult at the moment to pinpoint who actually retains accountability for these kinds of issues, but this is also ever more important in a situation where this work becomes very highly distributed, but many people rely on the data that are shared through digital platforms to continue their work and also to foster new practices in agriculture itself. And of course, there is a particular important condition relating to try and identify what are the gaps and in which ways the choices that have already been made in how do we share data create exclusions of certain groups from being able to contribute to these efforts, but also taking advantage of some of the benefits that come from these efforts. So really the premise of our work is that data linkage and intelligent openness are absolutely essential to developing coping strategy for agriculture in a rapidly changing planet. And this kind of intelligent openness includes questions around how do we tackle ethics and accountability issues in this area. So of course, you're all going to be very aware of the many advantages of having extensive data linkage opportunities for plant data. And this goes from being able to provide predictors for the health of the soil and the future performance of crops, to being able to monitor the spread of crop disease and crop pests, be able to detect disease in the first place, evaluate what could be the potential future consequences of different types of biotic and abiotic stresses, doing studies of agrodiversity and valuing particularly legacy and local crops. How does one think about the role of genomic tools and genomic markers in identifying valuable biomarkers in this area, estimating photosynthetic capacity of different varieties of crops, trying to understand complex multi-scale phenomena and really how the environment affects agriculture, which is really integral to the idea of precision agriculture in the first place. And of course, all of this means not just thinking about the integration of plant data, but how those data can be integrated further with environmental data and data about health. And particularly when one thinks about the interactions between genetic makeup of plant resources and environmental conditions, one is looking at a very heterogeneous set of data sources and a mix of quantitative, observational, and imaging data. And what this means is that in this area, it's ever more important to have a comprehensible and approachable labels for data that can be understood by the many different people who are producing these types of different data and are working at different levels in this system. One of the key issues is producing reliable and widely accepted ways of describing plant traits, which is particularly important because there's many different ways of thinking about what is a valuable trait for a plant, and these go well beyond more traditional taxonomic knowledge produced within the plant sciences and biology as a whole. And of course, there's also a lot of debate around what kind of metadata can best inform the further analysis of the data and the contextualization of the data. This means that when one thinks about plant data linkage, even at a very technical level, one is immediately confronted with the very diverse cultures of data exchange that exist across scales, across national and regional borders, and between the public and the private domains. So there is an urgent need for sharing, access, and reuse agreements among these different stakeholders. And this is particularly difficult and important in the case of heritage crops from the global south, where you want to be able to compare and integrate data from across the globe. And at the same time, you want to preserve the rights of people whose data are being used, particularly in the face of specific usages of the data in the global north and by private companies. So this is what the project that we're involved in at the moment is trying to do, to try and think about how plant data can be efficiently and reliably linked across data infrastructures around the world. If you're interested in some of the outputs that are coming out of this project, you can go to our website, which is datastudies.eu, and find out a little bit more about this. Now, a key issue here is the fact that responsible practice in this area tends to lag behind, surprisingly, despite the central importance that this has in this area. There is very often no clear intellectual property or legal agreements around data work here. There is an extensive lack of clarity over the goals, the rewards, the responsibilities, and the rights that relate to the generation, the circulation, and the use of digitalized plant data. So there is a strong emphasis on trying to make plant data digital, but very little emphasis often on what does it involve in terms of accountability and rights. There continues to be an unclear relationship between the germplasm acquired from farmers and breeders and digital data that is produced on this germplasm by researchers, industry, and governmental institutions. And this, of course, is in a context of data having many different kinds of value that go well beyond the purely scientific value, which range from commercial value, affective, economic, cultural, and political even. And this is really representing a major contrast with the biomedical field, which is a field where we have done also a lot of work with my group in Exeter. And this is a field where regulatory frameworks have long been at the very center of developments, particularly in the application of genomic technologies and data sharing. And this is partly because there's been a strong emphasis on the risks posed by sharing personal data. And there is a widespread perception that these personal data play a much lesser role in plant science. We're talking about data about crops, and these present, it is often thought, less of an issue when it comes to ethics. And in fact, we are trying to fight this perception by pointing out that actually there are so many social and ethical issues relating to plant data, even if these are not necessarily, though it can also be the case, data about the particular farming communities. They still present very big challenges. So we're trying to argue that data infrastructures require this kind of social intelligence, and this in turn requires transdisciplinary work across different disciplines, and also with experts based outside of the research realm and of academia. And therefore, you need multi-stakeholder discussions here. And these are also discussions that, as Godam exemplifies, need to be transnational, because we are looking at very often highly regulated areas within each nations and territory, but a situation where these data tend to transcend these borders very quickly through digital platforms and digital sharing. And so it's very unclear how these national regulations may apply in those cases. So we want to point to 4 factors that we will discuss between me and Hugh in a little bit more detail shortly, that are involved in this kind of social intelligence of data infrastructures. One is the idea of trying to encourage data stewardship that fosters a critical approach to data reuse. The second is to try and build these responsible practices right into the heart of the technical specification for data infrastructures. It's not enough here to just put ethics at the beginning and at the end of the process. It's really important that thinking about ethical constraints and ethical opportunities sits at the heart of how we set up the infrastructures for data sharing. It also is very important to have long-term involvement of data providers as stakeholders in these technical discussions, because otherwise people who are realizing the infrastructures don't have enough feedback from people who are eventually affected by data sharing to be able to implement those concerns into the infrastructures. And generally, this means encouraging a very wide-ranging debate over the goals and the concepts of human development that underpin this type of data sharing. So we're going to look very briefly at existing efforts in terms of the FAIR data, the legal and institutional frameworks and ethical specifications that are being developed in this area, and some of the work that we are doing in looking beyond infrastructures and ethics and considering the broader conceptual assumptions and frameworks used and underpinning this kind of work. So first of all, there's been a lot of discussion, of course, on trying to make data fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And these FAIR principles are well recognized now in plant science and agriculture. They're increasingly built into data collection at the source and management infrastructures. But these principles don't necessarily include questions around ethics and fairness in this kind of broader sense. They don't really interrogate questions around what is a just use of data and what does data justice mean in this context. So what FAIR principles really help with is critical reflection on what actually constitutes best practice in different domains, who sets the models and the standards, whether these standards are realistic, whether they're empirically warranted, and what kind of longer-term impact is sought. And they also have been really helpful, and again, Gordon has been very, very important in this space, in helping to recognize that it's not just the history of data in terms of where data come from that matters here, but also the history of data processing. And needs to be documented as part of infrastructures as an essential part of metadata. And of course, many different data infrastructures are trying to do exactly that at the moment. However, as I said, the FAIR principles don't really immediately require thought and systematic thinking around what are the social implications of applying these kinds of principles to data sharing. And this is where it's very important to look at the legal and institutional frameworks that exist in this area. There is, of course, an abundance of international agreements that regulate the use and the transfer of biological materials. The Plant Data Treaty, or the Plant Genetic Material Treaty, of course, and the Convention for Biological Diversity are working on this. And in crafting this type of agreement, there's been a long-term effort to think about what they would mean for for digital data, but in fact there hadn't really been a sustained a framework, internationally speaking, to think about the status of digital data and the regulation of digital data sharing in this area. There is a general agreement among the many organizations involved in this, and of course FAO is also leading in this area, around the fact that global plant data resources are really a common good and they need to be harnessed for the survival of humans and of the planet. But this recognition and this conceptualization continue to be tough to reconcile with trying to preserve the rights of indigenous groups and local breeders, who are very often providing the key germplasm and some of the key information in this area. And also the fact that many, in fact, the vast majority of plant trials and plant agricultural development is conducted by agrotech companies who do this very often in a private, in an accessible manner. So it's actually very, very difficult to exchange dialogue and discussions with companies working in the area at this level. So the question keeps being, what does data governance actually mean in the agricultural space, and who establishes it, and who is this actually meant to govern? One of the things we've been trying to do in our project, and we very much welcome also help in developing this, because we didn't really have much funding to do it so far, is to try and map data linkage, not just in terms of the hundreds of initiatives that are involved in this space, which other people, including Godam, have already done effectively, but the ways in which these initiatives are evolving over time and how their relationships are changing over time, because we think that this kind of temporal tracking is also very important to try and understand how the system of data governance internationally in this area is evolving and with which implications. Now, this is really a social technical problem, and just considering the key question of what counts as crop data production already illustrates this. There's lots of different ways of cashing out this question in terms of data. Is crop data production the result of growing the plant specimen themselves? Is that the key point where we're producing data about crops? Is it actually the selection of the strains that we want to cultivate? Is that where we're determining what counts as data production? Is this, in fact, the activity of designing field trials? Is that the crucial point of decision here? And are the people involved on that effort the key people to think about when thinking about data production? Or is it about adopting novel measurement tools, for instance, and thinking about who are the people who set the standards and produce these measurement tools in the first place, or even designing data storage? Now, each of these ways of answering the question of what counts as crop data production is valid in and of itself, but these different answers actually determine who is viewed as a legitimate owner of the data and who has control to some extent over their use. The lack of clarity over questions around what data production even means in this area is what leaves the door open potentially to bioprospecting and to what people are now discussing as digital feudalism, the idea that we're in a situation where we've seen centuries-long exploitation of locations, particularly in the global south, in providing agricultural resources, know-how, and germplasm to richer countries. And this kind of exploitation and discrimination risks, of course, to be built again and entrenched and even enforced and strengthened into the very data systems that we are now developing. And I'm now going to leave the floor to Hugh to continue with the next few points.
Thanks, Sabina. I will just share my screen.
Just while you're sharing your screen, Hugh, if I could just ask all attendees, if you have any questions for our panelists, then please can you put them in the chat or the question and answer section, and we'll get to them at the end. Thank you very much.
Great. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, it's great. Thanks, Hugh.
Fantastic. Okay, so in addition to the dimensions that Sabina's already been talking about, one of the additional things that has been relatively well developed is the introduction of various kinds of or sets of principles for introducing ethics into data infrastructures. And these are ways of ensuring that responsible practice is built into those core technical specifications, but by introducing certain things that data managers and data experts can be thinking about. So there are good examples of this in terms of principles that have been introduced as complements really to the FAIR principles, which have been focused on interoperability. But these new principles are focused much more on questions of responsibility and ethics. So one of the primary examples is the CARE principles, and that stands for collective benefit of data, authority to control data, the responsibility and ethics. And these are ways of thinking about how data management and use affects communities. And they were originally thought about in terms of the indigenous data governance, but arguably have a much wider relevance to how communities are affected by the uses of data for agriculture. Also, you have the trust principles, again, focused on questions of responsibility and transparency, but much more for data repositories. And then on top of these principles, you also have the set of work that, again, Godan has been leading exceptionally well in developing codes of conduct for how data is used and managed, particularly for companies and other actors who are using large amounts of data, which, I mean, codes of conduct are an especially interesting case because they involve a voluntary adherence, much like the principles, that has a high degree of regulation. And what all these allow is the development of tools that can ensure that data management and use really address privacy, consent, control, access, major issues in terms of the implications of data management for communities around the world. And another important element of this thinking about an introduction of ethics into data management questions is expanding participation and engagement with stakeholder communities through communities of practice. And there are a number of communities of practice that are very relevant to this space, the EGAD group within the RDA, and then also multiple communities of practice to do with data and agriculture in the CGIAR. And what communities of practice are able to do is to address issues such as the lack of harmonized concepts and nomenclature, which increases the standardization and allows people from very different backgrounds to exchange data and also benefit from it. Because in these communities of practice, you get the opportunity to bridge differences in knowledge by bringing together people from very different domains of practice, from different cultures, and also bringing expertise across social differences such as gender, and finding ways to coordinate between them so that a wide range of different forms of knowledge are brought into data management and the discussions around this. And the involvement of data providers is really critical to this, because this is where the knowledge of the relevant domain, data provenance, and the target systems that data is being collected from reside. This helps to forge data systems, the chains of evidence, and the conceptual tools that document and take account of local needs, knowledge, and the uses of plants that are the subject of the data use. But this is not an easy task. It's something that's very hard to elicit because the people involved in data provision are often very, very busy. There are issues with the lack of skills for scaling this up. Providing data and giving adequate detail about its provenance and what it relates to is very labor intensive, particularly where a high degree of standardization and labeling is involved. And this isn't really recognized as a professional activity. So finding support and sometimes funding for the people who do it can be a difficult task. And also, it can be challenging to the primary discourses around agricultural development and plant improvement that are present in the agricultural space at the moment, because this kind of inclusion of data providers from many different spaces, which includes farmers through to researchers, isn't necessarily always what's envisioned. And this brings us to our fourth point, which is to think that in order to improve the responsibility that's built into plant data management systems internationally, we need to think about diversifying the conceptual frameworks that we use to think about agriculture. Because data sharing in agriculture builds on a long history of extraction of local expertise from collection of wild varieties of plants to systems of different cropping systems that have been used around the world and are then brought into schemes of development and often reoriented towards high yielding models and repurposed really. And this is particularly so in relation to programs of genetic improvement of crop varieties, and also to tracking of food production and processing methods for market analysis with the aim of commercializing perhaps new varieties or new processes. It's also difficult to evaluate whether the regard for epistemic diversity that may be built into some of the data management systems in regard to the aspects of communities of practice, for example, and the collaboration going on there that we talked about, whether these aspects of epistemic diversity and differences in knowledge are preserved once data are repackaged and redistributed via transnational data infrastructures. And that's something that's quite important if we want to maintain the inclusion of different communities all the way down the line through data use. Otherwise, this is something that can get lost quite quickly as processing happens. And again, agricultural data sharing and reuse can facilitate dematerialization of biological materials, which may in turn lead to the exclusion of breeders and farmers from decision-making around crop choice and management. If, for example, we have genetic data from crop that is being abstracted away from the particular varieties and then made available on a data infrastructure, and there's no longer necessarily a need to have the material samples there anymore, it somewhat removes the direct participation of the breeders and farmers who have been the sources of that data. And so if we're thinking about the broader scope of agriculture at the moment and the frameworks in which development is being framed, we can think that this really comes as part of a normative legacy of the Green Revolution. And we're seeing at the moment a resurgence of science-led agriculture and crop breeding methods, for example, the developments in molecular breeding, technologies such as genomic selection and various marker-assisted technologies, the push for climate-smart agricultural methods, all of which are very data-driven and empirically focused. And this comes after a period, particularly from the 1980s and 1990s, that shifted away from that science-led model and towards a model of participatory breeding, which was perhaps slightly less intensive, but had a much more inclusive approach to farmers and the other stakeholders who are very important and need to be included in as sources of data and participants in discussions around its use. And so what this current science-led agricultural model adds up to is a distinctive vision for agriculture grounded in an imaginary of data use that can support market-led and high-yield monocultures for the most part. And although there are greater discussions around agroecology and similar topics, these haven't necessarily gone all the way into the mainstream yet. And so these conceptual frameworks are a key factor in assessing whether plant data linkage systems, projects and platforms are successful and or responsible. And we need to think about how current norms flank with increasing interest in agrodiversity, soil health and conservation of heritage crops, which are all very important and widely recognized now as paths towards sustainable agriculture. And one specific example that I can briefly give on this is the push towards increasing selection efficiency in many crop breeding programs, which is a very data intensive activity, but it's in implementing this and new data technologies that often speed up the process of breeding, there can be some conflicts and gaps really in the kind of crop varieties being produced and the rate of uptake of varieties by farmers. And this is a well-recognized issue now that that is often sometimes slips into the background in relation to the data-driven push for agricultural development. And it has been argued by some people that to improve the actual uptake of varieties, we need to engage a lot more with participatory breeding processes which can at times come into conflict or require a different mode of operating than heavily data-driven systems. And so what we need is a discussion of the trade-offs between these different modes and their role in structuring the data landscape and agricultural development strategies. And again, this involves engaging with stakeholders' knowledge throughout the whole data life cycle, and not just including stakeholders as data sources and then taking the data and handing it off to other experts. We need to include farmers, breeders, others in this kind of participatory process that goes all the way through, in this case, the crop breeding pipeline. And we also need to think about whether the needs for rapid crop breeding, which is very important for climate responsive agriculture, should necessarily come before a more open and deeper reflection on the priorities for agricultural systems. We don't necessarily want to dive headfirst into data-driven systems without thinking about the some of the implications that come along with this. And so data management and use needs to be flexible to these different conceptualizations of agriculture and crop breeding and so on. For example, collecting data resources for utilizing wider crop biodiversity, not just elite varieties that are focused on high input environments and high yielding outputs, which are a very dominant aspect of crop breeding at the moment. So this brings us to the concluding slide, which is to think about all these elements that we've talked about and Sabina has introduced earlier, and how we can think about bringing the conceptual dimensions of data linkage together with the ethical dimensions, the infrastructural and the legal dimensions of agro-data work. And what we need is to develop responsible and effective implementations of agricultural data. And this is going to require bringing together all of these in a much more engaged way and holistic way. Major global challenges such as climate change will really require significant rethinking of large-scale agricultural systems that include all the way from data collection through crop breeding and similar systems, and to agriculture and cropping systems, and then further down the food system. And these cannot be tackled without debate over those conceptual underpinnings that really structure the systems and all of their implications. And this brings us to the final slide, where we will just note that the research that we've done as part of the project comes from the Alan Turing Institute and European Council grants. And it would be nice now to draw your attention to a volume that we have forthcoming probably next year onto the topic of responsible plant data linkage, which comes from a workshop series that Sabina and I organised last month, the videos of which are available at our datastudies.eu website. You can see a link there, but you can also navigate to it via the main page of the website. And that volume brings together a range of experts from the plant data field, together with historians and philosophers of science who also have expertise on the topic, and reflect on the challenges currently in place for responsible plant data linkage. So I would encourage you all to go and look at those and say thank you for listening.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you, Sabina, for those fascinating insights. Just to let our participants know that we will be sharing the slides afterwards and send a follow-up email out to everybody that's registered for this webinar. So you will have access to all of those links and things that Sabina and Hugh have very kindly provided for us. I've dropped a few links into relevant GODAN work as well into the chat function. So if you're interested, you can have a look at those. And just to let everybody know, we'll be doing questions and answers now. But if you would like to ask your own question, please don't hesitate to put it in the chat function or in the question and answer function. So there's some absolutely fascinating questions that have come out of this. I'll start with Dan Lucier, and he is asking about data stewardship and data ethics in major agricultural production regions, and he's asking particularly about North America, Europe and Latin America, Are there any notable organisations that you could highlight in each of these regions that are active in developing data ethics or data stewardship in the agriculture and food sectors?
Thank you very much. And indeed, thanks for the many questions that are just great that have come up so far. So in terms of data governance in these different regions, I would say, I mean, my general understanding of the state of play at the moment is actually we are doing rather poorly. This is such a difficult field to try and regulate and establish data stewardship rules around, because there's so many different players, as we were trying to illustrate in our talk. So certainly in Latin America, one actor that has been doing a lot of work on this over decades is Embrapa in Brazil, and they still continue to be very active in international discussions in trying to foster some of these aspects. The FAO and the CGR also, because they have such a strong, if you want, critical mass in this area. There was another question that was asking about this, are also doing some work in this. And of course, whatever they end up doing will end up having repercussions for the situation at the national level and at the level of different regions and continents. I think generally speaking, of course, and within the EU, like organizations like Biodiversity, for instance, are working very closely with the FAO in trying to think about this landscape in more detail. And I think the key issue here is to realize that this is partly to do with the already extensive organizations and framework and infrastructure around agricultural development. But also this is where this intersects with the structures, organizations, and culture we have around digital technology in a much broader sense, right? And there was a question already about what is the role of big tech and data storage and data processing corporations like Google and Amazon in all of this. And of course, this also plays a very important role in this framework, which complicates things further, because in terms of trying and pushing rules around data stewardship and data ethics in the area, one has to take account of this very multifaceted and complex environment. So when it comes to, for instance, thinking about what farmers could do, there was another question around what rural farmers potentially could do in relation to this. I mean, Godan has already put out the link to their wonderful toolkit in terms of what can be learned about this area and how people should relate to this. But I think a very key issue that, I mean, I think we are now in an expert group together with the FAO, for instance, really trying to think about those issues and with various experts trying to get their head around this. But the key issue also for farmers is to realize how their personal lives, the ways in which they're using social media and the internet on an everyday basis, the ways in which they manage their farms, the kind of equipment that they're ordering, their interactions with companies that produce and provide seed and provide fertilizers, for instance, and also their interaction with the market and with regional, national organizations around agricultural policy. All of those interactions are actually producing data. And all of that data becomes a resource that can be potentially harnessed for good or bad in this arena. And so I think already a big step forward is for farmers and breeders, of course, particularly in rural areas, to realize actually how tethered their systems, their technologies, even just down to their smartphone, are to these much broader questions around data collection and to how we relate data linkage across countries. Hugh, do you want to add to this?
I don't think I have that much to add there specifically. I think Sabine's right in that regarding the specific regional question, that a lot of these things are happening much more at the international level still. You get pockets of institutions who are contributing greatly, such as Embrapa, but it's much more at the transnational level, which does include a lot of participants from those regions in particular, North America, Latin America, Europe, and also increasingly from Africa. But it's much more at those high level, the communities of practice that we were talking about, the data stewardship questions are being addressed.
Thank you. There's another question here from Nikos Kalatsis, if I've pronounced that correctly. So there's many parallel efforts in data standardization. And he's asking if there are any data models or efforts that have become more dominant that you're aware of that can make some form of critical mass, basically.
Yes, I mean, that's a great question and a very messy one. I mean, I can assure you, for us to trying to even map this field, as I was saying before, is becoming incredibly complex because there's things mushrooming everywhere. And I think this idea of the communities of practice that Hugh has already alluded to, it's a great one and a very interesting set of initiatives. So the Research Data Alliance has played a very interesting role and an important role in bringing together many different stakeholders, including GODAN, in these discussions. And so there is work going on in the community of practice around agricultural development, which is hosted by the Research Data Alliance, which I think is excellent in terms of really trying to bring together different kinds of agronomic data standards, trying to point to examples of best practice and provide a platform for best practice to be recognized and to become more visible. So I would really strongly invite people to look that up and potentially to join those efforts, because feedback is always very welcome and very needed in that area. Of course, another organization which has a lot of impetus in this area, just because of the sheer financial but also political weight that they have, particularly in the development of agriculture in the global south, is the CGR. And so the CG institutes are all being very heavily involved in developing standards for responsible data sharing practice. And this is now being shared again through a community of practice, which is working together with the crop ontology and other initiatives at the FAO, which are also looking at this area. So again, I think potentially very interesting work will come from those groupings, which are also collaborating with the Research Data Alliance. I think the key issue here to remind ourselves of, and again, there's been quite a few questions coming up on this, is the fact that we are operating in an incredibly asymmetrical field, where it's very easy to share data to some extent. I mean, you may not be doing it particularly well or effectively, but it's easy to share data. And it's incredibly difficult, particularly for farmers, to reap the benefits out of that data sharing exercise. And historically, that's really, I mean, there's not obvious mechanisms to do this. The market is supposed to mediate this, but we know very well that you know, there's been many cases where this has not quite gone into favor of the market, of the farmers themselves. And so when we're thinking about this landscape, we're really thinking more generally about what is the policy around agricultural development in each country. So even involvement with policymakers actually in different territories in each country, and farmers actually lobbying policymakers to really look at the regulation of data sharing in this area would be very useful, because ultimately this is really where the game is played to some extent.
Okay, Rob Davidson is asking about bioprospecting, which was briefly mentioned. Are there any documented cases that can be pointed out with which to inform policymakers?
Yeah, so that's thanks a lot. That's a great question. It's also a complex one to answer so quickly, because the whole field of the history of agriculture, which is quite a big field, basically is devoted 90% to documenting the incredibly extensive history of bioprospecting that has accompanied the development of modern agriculture. So depending on how far back you want to go, pretty much most of the main crops that are commercialized, particularly in the global north today, have been crops developed through very extensive bioprospecting from the south of the world, and that goes from stable crops from rice to maize to banana, you name it. I think that history is very extensively documented. Maybe more interesting also in terms of discussing this with policymakers is what we're seeing happening now with legacy crops and heritage crops that are becoming more and more relevant beyond the territories where they've been typically used, because with the climate changing, crops that live in difficult and very dry and hot environments are becoming very relevant also for developed economies in the global north of the world. So for instance, if one looks at the efforts, which are very extensive, to acquire data around cassava, this is clearly a staple crop for many different parts of the world, but has not been extensively commercialized and disseminated in the north of the world and by many rich countries. So potentially represents a whole new market for the global north to get their hands on. And this can have a lot of advantages for the economies and the cultures which are already involved in breeding different varieties of cassava. But everything will depend on what agreements will be made around, what benefits the communities of breeders and farmers who are already experts on different varieties of cassava will get out of sharing their knowledge, so that we get better and better development of varieties that can be developed with high yield also in the north and commercialized also in the north of the world. And I think is these kinds of cases, I mean, with yam, for instance, we've seen a similar situation. These are the kinds of cases that we need to keep very closely in mind, because this is where a lot of the game is still played. And so there is a very interesting space here to make sure that there is a more equitable distribution of benefits coming out of research on these kinds of crops.
So around agricultural data vocabularies, Marco is mentioning AgriVoc as one of the big ones that comes out of the FAO. And Hugh obviously mentioned that there was a lack of harmonized concepts. But Marco's really wanting to know, do you think, both of you, he's wanting both of your opinions, whether more can be done to obtain a satisfactory level of harmonization? And if so, in what area or how do you think this could be done?
So thanks for the question, Marco. I would definitely say the example of AgriVoc is it's a positive example rather than a kind of an example of the absence of harmonization. What's being done there is clearly quite substantial work, particularly within the FAO, to try and integrate across a wide number of languages and produce new standardized thesauruses. And I think in terms of the level of sufficiency, that's what counts as sufficient in terms of harmonization is always going to depend on the aims that the data is being put to. And if we think about the difference between thesauruses and ontologies in this regard, they are very similar in terms of the standardization of terminology, but they can serve different purposes, particularly to do with the degree of semantic detail that's included, which has implications for interoperability and so on. And for some cases, it's going to be very important to have very well-developed semantic standards that can allow interoperability of data through machine applications. But in other cases, and in certain kinds of agricultural research framework, that's probably not going to be directly relevant, or it may not be relevant to the capacities of the research or breeding institute or even on farm. So I think that's my answer. The question of sufficiency is always going to vary. Sabina may have a different perspective or want to add something there.
I think I'll leave it a bit just in case you want to also broach other questions, and partly because I was trying to add links in the meantime.
Okay, in which case,
Thank
yes.
you very much. So there's been so many fantastic questions, and I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to all of them, but we'll try for one or two more before we close our computers. So I would just like to bring up this idea of digital feudalism or data feudalism that was touched on, and what you think the main risks of this digital feudalism effect, when you were talking about kind of the large tech companies that are involved in digital agriculture. What do you think that are the biggest effects that this may have on small scale farmers?
I mean, clearly there is a huge question around data ownership here. That's what everybody who's involved in this field starts from, of course. The Godin work in this has also started from this problem. It's not really clear who owns the data. And in fact, there have been strong arguments that data actually cannot be owned. This is something that can be copied so easily. Is also a common good, you know, is a knowledge good, if you want knowledge commons, that should be shared, right? But then this perspective is being used by some stakeholders to in fact appropriate the data, and to do that without any accountability to other people that may want to use the data, right? And of course, there is also a question around who has the capacity to use data. So this is really what matters the most. We can talk a lot about making data accessible, and of course, that's a very important step in some ways. But really what matters in this field is who can use the data and to do what, right? So if there is a general access to the data, but the majority of breeders, for instance, don't have the skills and the computational capability to then use that data to produce new knowledge around which variety may be more effective or which kind of plant trial to put together, then automatically the accessibility of the data doesn't serve those stakeholders. It serves the kind of labs, the kind of institutions, the kind of companies that have enough skills and in-house expertise and computational power to be able to take advantage of that information, right? So in that sense, I think one of the key issues here is because of this issue of the problems around data ownership, is when releasing data, being very careful around the conditions under which data are being accessed, and whether there is any reciprocity built into the data access system. And I know that some of these solutions are very unpopular with researchers who really would like to have all the data available immediately so that research can go fast and one can browse data without having to worry about the conditions under which these data are being accessed. But I also really do think that there are very intelligent ways of accessing data and sharing data and studying data that also recognize the fact that there's got to be some conditionality relating to the use of that data, right? In biomedicine, this is absolutely established. There's very few people who advocate that all of our genetic data from our medical records should be put online so that biomedical research can develop faster. Certainly it's true that if all of the genetic data of the whole world population were put online, biomedical research would go faster. It would also be a complete and utter disaster in terms of people's medical insurance, in terms of how different employers could use that information, and so on and so forth. Now, I think the situation with agronomic data right now is not very dissimilar to this. It's just that the will to try and think about what kind of data silos, what kind of data infrastructures can we put together to monitor data access, not to stop it, but to just make sure that whenever people use data, they also give back something to the communities that created the data. I mean, the will to create this is not fully there yet. I don't think it's fully recognized that this is just as important as in biomedical field. But I think it's very important. And there's not going to be one solution, right? There's, for instance, one suggestion in the Q&A now that what we can do is simply to change the Creative Commons licensing attached to the data. Now, this may be a solution or not. It's not clear to me that we want to block any commercial use of the data, because actually it's very, very important to have companies involved in developing and doing some of this research. But the problem is, however you want to think about the problem, just tackling licensing is not enough, right? I mean, this needs to come with a much more systematic thought about who are we giving our data to, which kinds of companies, which services are used to store this data, at which conditions, is there any regulation that affects, for instance, the work of big companies that store the data like Google. This is, of course, something that is happening within Europe, but it's definitely not happening much in North America, right? So these type of conversations, you know, that is very complex, but they need to be talking to each other, because all of these are part of the solution. Hugh, sorry, do you want to add?
For time reasons, I will leave it there, I think.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. just to let everybody know that I have dropped the link to the GODAN Data Rights and Responsible Data Working Group chat. But I will also be sending out information about how you can get involved. The Data Rights Working Group was responsible for a lot of the work and the background work that went into the Data Codes of Conduct tool. So, you know, you can actually get involved and make a difference if you wish to. We'll also be sending out a follow-up email, as we mentioned, to everybody who registered to this event, with links and information from both ourselves and the University of Exeter. All that remains to do is thank our colleagues Sabina and Hugh massively for their participation today. Thank you for coming to talk to us and share your expertise.
Thanks very much to you all.
Great.
Goodbye.